So today we speak about interdisciplinarity and mobility. The goal of today was to give a focus on concrete application of ICT and its impact. I just wanted also to speak about fictional abstract a bit, because it's not the today subject. Okay, I will speak about that after the talk. But first, I will introduce Catherine Lyall. We speak about interdisciplinarity. And yeah, maybe I will just let her start because we're a bit late. So, Catherine, you can start.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I'm talking to you this morning from my home in the Scottish Borders. I hope that you've had a good start to your doctoral summer school. I'm not going to talk specifically about ICT this morning, but I'm going to talk in more general terms about inter and indeed transdisciplinary research. And I'm going to introduce you to some resources which I hope you might find useful during the remainder of your week at the doctoral school. So first of all, a little bit about myself. My first degree is actually in chemistry, but I now find myself working in a school of social and political science. And I came to this route via science studies, science policy in particular. So my doctoral education is in science policy. And for a number of years at the University of Edinburgh, I worked in a research centre that described itself as an interdisciplinary research centre, but did not really reflect at all on what that meant in terms of methodologies, perhaps. It didn't consider the impact that that had on the careers, and the training and the development of its early career researchers within that group. And so I became interested in interdisciplinarity as an object of study in its own right. And as a result of that experience, we produced this book together, the Interdisciplinary Research Journeys. And then my career developed and evolved. And some 10 years later, I returned to this subject of interdisciplinary careers. I was able to take a sabbatical, and I spent some time interviewing British academics who had always been interdisciplinary by nature of their doctoral training. They had been funded by the Research Council to do specifically interdisciplinary PhDs. And some of them were now quite senior and quite advanced in their careers. Some of them were some 15 years post-PhD. And so I was interviewing these academics about their experiences as interdisciplinarians. So essentially doing career history interviews, finding out what the challenges had been, what their motivations had been, what the kind of key points had been in their careers. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and I'll draw on some of that experience in the next half hour or so. But I'm going to talk mainly this morning about a project that I've more recently been involved in, the SHAPE-ID project. This was funded by the European Union under the Horizon 2020 programme. It was led by a team headed by Jane Olmeyer at Trinity College Dublin, and its full title is Shaping Interdisciplinary Practices in Europe. Now, this was a coordination support action. It ran for about 2.5 years, and within a coordination support action, you're not necessarily doing de novo research. It's more of a synthesis of state-of-the-art. In many ways, this felt a little bit like a piece of consultancy work for the European Commission. Because of the way the call for the proposals was framed, it was very clear that the Commission were finding it difficult to promote their interdisciplinary research funding as widely as they felt they ought to be able to do. It certainly won't have escaped your notice that many research funders these days are talking about interdisciplinary research. We have this quote here from a former commissioner for research innovation within the European Union, talking about, you know, the exciting and groundbreaking innovations happening at the intersection of disciplines. But in fact, the full quotation goes on to say something about, but we're not actually achieving our full potential in this field at the moment. So the focus around interdisciplinary research, as indeed I'm sure you know, given the work that you're doing in your own studies, is that, you know, today's global societal challenges are wicked problems. They're complex, they're multifaceted, and that in order to develop a solution, we need to take a variety of different disciplinary approaches and indeed practitioner approaches and perspectives. And that's where the transdisciplinary aspects come in. So there is this assumption, not least within the European Commission, that tackling such wicked problems with an inter or transdisciplinary research approach can have greater impact. Nevertheless, what we were encountering within this study, and really what prompted the funding of this study in the first place, was what Peter Weingart has called the paradox of interdisciplinarity, where we see it promoted at policy level in response to these societal changes, but at the same time poorly encouraged or rewarded at the institutional level. And that indeed was what I was finding in my study of British academics and some of the challenges that they were finding, that they were encountering in their careers within British universities. So this lay at the heart of the SHAPE-ID project, and in particular a recognition that scholars from the arts and humanities in particular, and the social sciences to a lesser degree, are perhaps less involved in large interdisciplinary research consortia that are funded by the European Union than perhaps is ideal. So that was really the motivator for the SHAPE-ID project. It's worth just thinking that amidst all this rhetoric about the benefits of inter and transdisciplinarity, there's a certain degree of naivety about how it actually happens, how it takes place. And if you can read the cartoon caption there for yourselves, you know, I would argue that actually it isn't just sitting about waiting for the magic to happen, that it actually takes a considerable amount of work, particularly when you're at the PhD stage, in order to bring together different disciplines and different ideas in order to provide a more integrated approach. So we could spend the next half hour just talking about what we mean by interdisciplinary research. And indeed, we've argued elsewhere in a paper just recently published in Science and Public Policy that there are many meanings of inter and transdisciplinarity, and that it's actually inadvisable to impose one single definition. Having said that, I'm now going to suggest a definition to you. It's one that's quite widely used by the National Academies of Sciences in the US. It's one that I use when I'm teaching interdisciplinary research design, because I think that this quote actually highlights a number of different aspects of interdisciplinary research. First of all, you see there that I've highlighted that it's a mode of research by teams or individuals, and we sometimes forget that an individual researcher can be interdisciplinary. We assume that this is always a team-based collaboration. The next aspect that I wanted to highlight is that interdisciplinary research, distinctive from other forms of collaboration, actually involves some sort of integration, something new that wasn't there in the first place, because you've brought together ideas, concepts, data from different dimensions, from different disciplines. And then thirdly, I think there's this aspect as to why we do interdisciplinary research. Often it's seen, as I've already illustrated in my slides, it's seen as a way of solving problems. Problems who have solutions beyond the scope of a single discipline or area of practice. But also I think it's important not to forget that this is also how fundamental understanding evolves and develops. It's how new disciplines have evolved and developed, for example, the coming together of knowledge from different areas. If we to think about what characterises a discipline, you know, we generally share the same background, training, we have shared methods, shared practices, often a lot of shared tacit knowledge. And so discipline-based research, the discipline will often determine the kinds of questions that are asked, the types of methods that are used, the underlying theories and concepts that we draw on. And this will lead to a stable community of researchers who share similar training, similar experiences, similar mindsets. And we then develop these social networks of peers, these invisible colleges, and we tend to develop our own languages, our own use of language, our own jargon, which can then be exclusive for others. So what happens when we step outside that discipline? And this can present particular quality issues for students who are studying, researching for an interdisciplinary PhD. Because one of the key aspects of this is that the basis for judging quality can vary among disciplines. I mentioned tacit knowledge. You know, there's a sense of how we do things within our discipline. And as a PhD student navigating across two, maybe even more disciplines, you have to determine what the norms are and how you cut across those norms in many respects. So you might encounter supervisors from different disciplines who have quite different expectations of you. And there will be these research design challenges that I've already spoken about in terms of bringing together different methodologies, how you anchor your research in a body of literature which you essentially have to assemble yourself because you're building up a new canon of literature. So these are very common challenges when undertaking an interdisciplinary PhD. Not least if you're trying to combine qualitative and quantitative methodologies. And underlying that is this sense of, you know, what is good research if you don't have that disciplinary underpinning, or you're marrying together different disciplines. All of which means, if we go back to the cartoon, all of this means that it takes extra time to navigate these differences when studying for an interdisciplinary PhD. We're increasingly also talking about the extra interdisciplinary skills that are required. They're sometimes called meta skills. So it takes a certain attitude of mind, an openness to new perspectives, a certain degree of humility to admit that perhaps your original discipline didn't have all the answers, a certain willingness to be wrong, and a willingness to spend time understanding the positions and the motives of others. So reflexivity is important in any form of, certainly any form of social research, but especially so when undertaking something that's more interdisciplinary. That said, there is often a tendency, particularly with enthusiastic PhD students, to think that, you know, well, I could just bring all sorts of different ideas into my research. So it's important to remember that interdisciplinarity doesn't mean everything. You know, you cannot take everything into account because the result will then be a very shallow study. It might also be a very long PhD, and PhDs in most universities tend to be fairly time limited. Disciplines, of course, have found a way of putting boundaries around knowledge, and that's much more difficult in interdisciplinary research. So you really need to impose those boundaries yourself. You need to negotiate those boundaries. You need to draw on the advice and expertise of your supervisors and your colleagues to try to help you deal with that. So yeah, interdisciplinarity is not just a pick and mix of whatever takes your fancy. It needs to be highly selective. This is obviously something at the bedrock of all good research design, but it's especially important for an interdisciplinary research design, and also keeping sight of what the integrative focus is. What is it you're actually trying to achieve by bringing together knowledge from more than one discipline? Now, if we think back to what characterises a discipline, then obviously undertaking something that crosses those disciplinary norms can have implications for academic careers. I think doing an interdisciplinary postgraduate degree can have a real benefit if you want to pursue a career outside of academia. I think within academia, it can still have its challenges. And that was certainly what I was finding from my career history interviews with my British academics. Because academia is still by and large organised around single disciplines, whether that's departments or schools, however you're organised within your own university. And so this means that colleagues may be less able to appreciate what it is you're trying to do, for all the reasons we've talked about in terms of how we come sort of acclimatised, accustomed within our own disciplines. There are certain quality markers that are still problematic in terms of peer review, whether that's getting your work published or getting your work funded. Certainly from my own experience and from the interviews I've completed with my British academics, that institutional advancement can be more problematic. And this all requires you to be a little bit more strategic in your approach. So being very thoughtful and reflective about which journals you target for your publications. Now, in certain areas, certainly in sustainability science, many of these challenges are being overcome. I think that you maybe will find that in sustainability and ICT, there are possibly more opportunities and openings, but it depends very much on the type of research you're doing. And especially if you're approaching this from an arts and humanities perspective, I think you may still encounter some of these challenges. Certainly when I was interviewing, and I've put a couple of quotes up, it was very clear from the interviews that early career researchers in particular were receiving quite mixed messages about the benefits of interdisciplinarity. Think back to Peter Weingart's paradox, where on the one hand, these people were being encouraged by their funding body to undertake interdisciplinarity, and yet Mariana on the one hand was saying, you know, there's all this rhetoric about wanting people who can do interdisciplinary research, but in fact what they want is somebody with a strong discipline background, who has the ability to work in an interdisciplinary team, but can then go back to their own parent discipline. So that is a very different form of interdisciplinarity, and one might argue not really interdisciplinary, it's more of a multidisciplinary approach. And then one of the quotations from Ruben, these are pseudonyms obviously, was his experience. He was talking about his experience of going towards a European Research Council panel. He had been applying for funding from ERC, and he talked about the challenges of deciding which panel he should submit to. And he went for the interview. He went through the biology panel in the end. He was doing a mix across anthropology and biology. And one of the first questions the panel asked him was, "Are you one of us? You know, do you belong? Do you have the training, the rigor to be a biologist?" was essentially what was being asked. So again, just reflecting on the fact that this is still a very challenging area, where we don't yet have perhaps enough momentum and enough capacity. So what do we need to do in order to build that capacity? We talked within the SHAPE-ID project about how we need to develop skills and leadership. So it's wonderful that you're getting together and have this mutual support within the doctoral summer school. You can work together with people of like mind. So this idea of enabling interdisciplinary encounters. Being quite open about the benefits and the risks of interdisciplinarity when it comes to research careers. Thinking particularly, as we were in the SHAPE-ID project, about how we champion interdisciplinarity that not just involves the arts, humanities and social sciences, but is actually led by those disciplines. Too often the arts, humanities and social science disciplines play what Andrew Barry has called a subordinate or a service role within collaborations, which are essentially led by the STEM disciplines, and where the research agendas are set by the STEM disciplines. So we were looking within the SHAPE-ID project about how we can support interdisciplinary teams, how we can promote interdisciplinary education. And the key outcome from the SHAPE-ID project was an online Interactive Toolkit. You might want to just type that URL in if you've got your tablet or your laptop in front of you. It might be interesting just to explore the toolkit a little as I'm talking. I'll spend the next probably 10 minutes, I'm just keeping an eye on the time, so I'll probably just spend 10 minutes or so taking you through some of the resources that we've curated within this toolkit. So really, the goals of the toolkit, first and foremost, I think, were to inspire and encourage people who have not so far been significantly involved in inter and transdisciplinary research. So we were looking to inform and to instruct quite a wide range of different users, and I'll talk about the users a little bit more in a moment. And our goal was very much not to develop the toolkit from scratch ourselves, but to use it as a gateway, if you like, in order to provide guidance and signposting to a lot of the resources that are already available. One of the real challenges, which I'm sure you've already encountered in your own work, is that there is quite a lot of knowledge about conducting inter and transdisciplinary research, but it's very dispersed. It isn't all together in one place. So a lot of what we were trying to do with the toolkit was to curate existing resources and provide signposting to them. And particularly to do this in a way that guided people who were less familiar with the field towards the information that they needed. Obviously, there are other toolkits. We looked at a few. The European Commission already has one around responsible research and innovation, and we looked at a few just to sort of get a sense of what we thought worked well, what we wanted to try and reproduce within our own resources. I think what's unique about the SHAPE-ID Toolkit is this targeted lens on the contributions that the arts and humanities and the social sciences can bring to inter and transdisciplinarity. Although I said that we were trying to draw together the work that other people have done, we actually ended up writing quite a few bespoke guides and discussion tools ourselves, because we realised that there were gaps in what was available. I said that coordination and support action is essentially a synthesis project, but in doing that synthesis, and we did some quite extensive literature reviews which have been published, in conducting that synthesis, we were aware that there were some current gaps and deficits, and this was something that our expert advisory panel encouraged us to do, to actually fill those gaps with some of our own new materials. Above all, I think what we tried to do with the toolkit was to provide some guided navigation. This is a case of, if you're new to an area, you don't really know what you don't know, and so we were trying to not overwhelm new users with information, but to give them a guided introduction so that they could then find the information that was of most use to them. So particularly targeting this at newcomers. So the European Commission had asked us to take into consideration 4 potential users, and that was research individuals like ourselves, but also research organisations, research institutes, higher education institutes. We were very much targeting some of the material at funders and policymakers, and also bringing in, because this was about not just interdisciplinary research, but also transdisciplinary research, we wanted to be able to reach other societal partners, other potential actors within research collaborations. Of course, that's quite a challenge because these stakeholders and practitioners could come from a wide range of circumstances, whether it's society, business, the creative arts. So that is an area of the toolkit that I think we would very much like to see developed further, because we were conscious that we hadn't perhaps done that justice. So 4 user pathways, and you can enter the toolkit, as you go through the toolkit, you can enter as a research individual, and it will then present you with a particular set of guided pathways. In addition to these guided pathways, which I'll talk about in a moment and show you some examples, we have a series of case studies, which we felt was quite helpful to people, particularly people who didn't really understand what the arts and humanities might bring to an interdisciplinary research endeavour. And we've provided some case study material of examples of inter and transdisciplinary research projects that have been led by the arts and humanities. So we include a series of downloadable guides, and I'll show you some examples. There are a few guided tours, just some little video clips, just to help you find your way around. The frequently asked questions, I think, are also quite a helpful way of navigating. Particularly if you're new to a field, it will then, through the sort of question and answer format, help you to target the bits of the toolkit that are most useful to you. So if you go in through the guided pathways, then it will open up a series of options. We've identified a series of tasks, if you like, things that people might be interested in. So depending on which user you've selected, you'll be presented with slightly different configurations. So, for example, if you want to find out more about what inter and transdisciplinarity is, if you want to understand that better, you can follow that option. You might want to learn more about how you create collaborative conditions in order to co-create a research project. We have a section there specifically on developing a career in inter and transdisciplinary research. So if you select one of these options, you will then go into, and we have a sort of standard format as you would expect. We have a series of drop-down menus, these concertinas, which allow you to then explore in more detail. As you click on these options, these concertinas, it will open up to a series of different media. So it might lead you to a relevant reference, a journal article. It might take you on to a link to another resource, another website, another toolkit. It might lead you on to some of the short guides that we've produced. So a variety of media, a variety of formats, but essentially signposting you, as I said, to some of the resources that already exist. So in this one, we're looking at how you develop a career in inter and transdisciplinary research. So some advice on supervision, how you develop your networks, some sort of career suggestions beyond the PhD, for example, and you'll find further resources within that. I think I won't, in view of the time, go into this in a great deal of detail. We've already talked a little bit about some of the challenges of doing interdisciplinary research in terms of where you go for advice and support. And some of the, this is actually a slide from one of my colleagues, and I think her sense of frustration comes through in the final point, where she says that however much universities and funding processes, promote inter and transdisciplinarity, negotiating these structures as an interdisciplinary scholar can be quite time consuming. So we've tried to put together some very short tips, as well as leading you into all of the materials that are kind of out there and available. We've written ourselves, I said we'd written a few bespoke guides. So there is a short guide there, top 10 tips on developing inter and transdisciplinary academic careers. You'll find one on mentoring, and that was an interesting one to write because we actually worked with some early career scholars from Finland who have been bringing together a network of interdisciplinary researchers in Finland, and we talked to them about the sort of mentoring processes that they found helpful and otherwise. So a few examples there. Again, if you select, if you're interested in how you develop collaborative conditions, you'll go through the same sort of menu processes. And we have a reflective tool that we wrote, which we hope that maybe a group beginning a research collaboration might download and use as a sort of guide. So often, and we've done this ourselves, you embark on an interdisciplinary research collaboration with a new group and realise that actually it would have been helpful to have set a few ground rules from the outset, maybe to have talked a little bit more about who was going to lead on certain aspects, what the publication strategy was going to be. So hopefully these questions would provide some areas of reflection that might be helpful when starting a new collaboration. Again, co-creating a research project, similar sort of format, and our colleague Christian Paul talked about how to work successfully in multi-stakeholder collaborations. The format that we've adopted for this one, because it was particularly targeted at different stakeholder groups, we've identified different potential partnerships. Sorry, let me go back. Oops.
Sorry, Catherine.
That's what I want. So that different potential partnerships, whether it's with artists and creative practitioners, whether it's with citizens groups, whether it's with business, or whether it's with charities in the voluntary sector. As I said, it's a very substantial area when we start to talk about transdisciplinary research. And this is an aspect of the toolkit that we would like to see developed a little bit more. So I think in view of the time, I'm probably going to close there. You will no doubt want to explore the toolkit a little bit more and find out exactly what's useful for you at your current stage and in your current situation. I would just like to acknowledge I was one of a team that developed the toolkit. I'd like to acknowledge the work of my collaborators in the SHAPE-ID project and the funding that we received from the European Union. You'll see there some further web links, including the toolkit link again, and my own email address. I hope that's given you a few things to think about, maybe some things to discuss later in the week, maybe some resources to go back to. And I hope that I haven't frightened you off this topic of interdisciplinary research, that despite the interdisciplinary madness that you see on that final cartoon, it is actually a very worthwhile area of work to pursue. So I'll stop sharing my slides, and hopefully that's given us a little bit of time for discussion and questions. I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you, Catherine. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're just in time. It was really clear, and I really like your presentation. And I think maybe most of us will need these advices of SHAPE-ID. Do you have any question in the?
Any question here?
Okay, no, it works. Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you, Catherine, for this talk. I had a question about epistemology, because there is something you haven't talked about. And I'm a bit struggling with that regarding interdisciplinarity. There is a paper I read like 2-3 weeks ago about an undisciplinary journey. It's early career researchers who wrote this paper. And it's really interesting because they define themselves, they don't know how to define themselves actually, because they do interdisciplinarity research. And then they talk about how they try to ground their methodology in a place, in a discipline, an area at least, and then to have this epistemologic agility. And I wanted to know your opinion on that, and how hard or easy is it for you to deal with that, especially in the toolkits, in the toolkit you show. How do you tackle this question? And especially in ICT, we are working with really quantitative, positivist, so quantitative methodology in a positivist epistemology. And I'm more interpretativist, I think, for example. And sometimes it's really hard to discuss with people on that. So yeah, what's your point of view on that?
Yeah, there's a lot there in that question, isn't there? And you've really gone to the heart of what a lot of the struggles are. And I think a lot of us, I certainly recognise the challenges that you're talking about. I'm sure a lot of people in the lecture hall do as well. And it was something that came up in my interviews, when I was doing the interviews for my book. One of the questions I asked my respondents was how they identified, you know, as academics. I vividly remember many years ago meeting a university colleague who had come into the university having had a career in business. And he said, you know, the first question that people ask me is what's my discipline? And he said, you know, in business, people didn't care what my degree was in. They just wanted to know what my skills were and what I could do. but discipline is still something that defines us as academics in so many different ways. Whether it defines the way we think, you know, and you've talked about our epistemological stances, whether it defines where and how we work, the methodologies that we use. I absolutely resonate with what you're saying about this quantitative-qualitative challenge. I'm encountering it myself at this exact minute in a piece of work that we've done for the Scottish Government, where we're having to explain to them that yes, this is good quality research because it's qualitative research and it's actually different from quantitative survey data. So yeah, all of those things, and perhaps it's not very encouraging if I'm telling you that this doesn't actually go away in your interdisciplinary life and career. So going back to the book, it was quite interesting that a lot of my respondents had thought very carefully about their identities, and they had crafted different identities. In some cases, in some instances, they presented themselves slightly differently depending on their audience, depending on who they were working with, depending on which conference they were attending. They would either emphasize the more social dimensions, or perhaps the more ecological dimensions, the more environmental credentials that they had, and so forth. Some of them had deliberately evolved and changed their identities as academics, and had been quite explicit in the labels that they gave themselves. I remember one of them saying, you know, I didn't want to be known as this. I wanted specifically to be known as this type of researcher, because she felt that it would be more advantageous to her career. So I think this sense of not being grounded and not having these roots is very much a characteristic of interdisciplinary research. And I'm not sure that it ever really goes away, but I think you find ways of navigating and negotiating it. I mean, even in terms of the work that I do at the moment, I suppose I now talk about doing research on research, which has become a sort of buzzword, you know, that this is, if I'm trying to characterize my own field, this is what I do. So yeah, I'm not really answering your question, but I am just sort of echoing that this is very much a challenge, and it's something that you as individuals will have to negotiate within your own context, I think, and you will, as we all do, we all develop as academics. I think your identity will evolve. So I think that's what I would say on that question.
Thank you so much for your answer.
Good morning, Catherine. Thanks a lot for the presentation. I'm involved in a number of interdisciplinary projects at this moment. One recurring issue I see in all of them is that of hiring PhD students in these scenarios, mostly because the expectations of PIs who typically belong to one specific discipline, let's say law or humanities or engineering, is to find a candidate who fits that specific discipline, and interdisciplinary profiles who are knowledgeable in both domains typically have a disadvantage there because they don't have an initial publication in engineering. So I'm really wondering how we can bridge this somehow. And it's not just about PIs, it's also about doctoral schools who prefer the candidates with a strong profile in one discipline rather than the ones with broad knowledge. And the result that I often see is that projects then work on two different pillars, and at the end you do one joint publication where you try and stick it all together. But of course, it's not as interesting as what you would get if you work across both disciplines throughout the 3 years or 4 years of the project.
Yeah, exactly. I can only agree with the questioner, and I exactly see this problem. It's this issue of how do we decide what quality looks like. And at the moment, predominantly in our universities, we measure quality using a disciplinary lens. And so we see this often in, for example, in promotion cases at the university, where people are not recognised for they're integrative, they're interdisciplinary skills. They are measured by their outputs in terms of disciplinary metrics. And you're right that, you know, we, as I said, this is the paradox of interdisciplinarity, which we are gaining momentum. We are seeing more knowledge. This is what we hope to do with the toolkit, I suppose, is to share the knowledge that there are ways of helping us to assess quality, helping us to integrate. You talked about the fact that you end up with essentially a multidisciplinary project that doesn't have the strength and depth that an interdisciplinary study could have had. And in some respects, one of the conclusions I came to in my book is that we won't start to really address these deficits and these mismatches until we start to recognize the value of an interdisciplinary education at an earlier stage. So, I mean, I don't know what it's like in your countries. In the UK, we see a lot of courses that are described as being interdisciplinary, but as Katrina Lindvig from Copenhagen has said, they're really just a sort of pick and mix of different courses, and it's left to the student to do the interdisciplinary integration. Until we actually start to see truly interdisciplinary undergraduate education and start to value the skills, that what we've called the meta skills that interdisciplinarians bring, recognizing that they will not be the best lawyer or the best engineer, but the skills that they bring in understanding both fields and building bridges between them. And there's a quote that I use a lot from Lisa Latuka, who's an American scholar of interdisciplinarity, and she says something like, you know, we're responsible for creating our own academic research cultures, so that means we can also change them. And it is a very slow process of change that we're all going through, and you're part of at the moment. And I think that's what I would say. Again, recognizing and acknowledging all the things that the questioner has raised, and not really having a ready answer for it, but saying that this is part of the process of change within our universities. That if we are, and I'm not, I suppose I should always say at the beginning of my talks that I'm not anti-discipline. You know, I do absolutely recognize the benefits and the value of people who want to pursue a single discipline with great dedication. But at the same time, that shouldn't be to the detriment and exclusion of people who want to work in a different way. And so, yeah, it's about culture change, which is rather an unsatisfactory answer.
One more question.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. You presented the interdisciplinary research paradox that dates back from the very beginning of the 21st century. And so I wanted to know your vision about the future of interdisciplinarity in the next few years, perhaps, or do we have to wait for the 22nd century for things to get better?
Yeah, that's a big question for early in the morning, isn't it? What's my vision for interdisciplinarity? Parity, I think, you know, so that interdisciplinary researchers aren't seen as some sort of second-class citizen within universities, that they are actually recognized and rewarded for what they do. I think it's a harder path to follow at the moment within universities to be an interdisciplinary researcher, despite all the rhetoric. And the rhetoric, yes, you were right to say that Peter Weingart's quote comes from the start of this millennium. In fact, we've been talking about interdisciplinarity since the early 1900s. Julie Klein dates it back to being used by the Social Sciences Research Council in the States in the early 1900s. So yeah, this is a long, slow process. But I would hope that my vision is that we become recognized for the true value that we bring, and that we are measured accordingly, appropriately. Yeah, appropriate evaluation. Maybe that would be my vision. Yeah.
Any other question here? Okay, I have maybe a really quick one, which might sound very basic for you, but I think that might be of interest for people in the room. Could you maybe explain quickly the difference between multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity? Like, I know that it could sound basic, but I think this will really help us during the week such that everyone here uses the same word for what it defines. So if you could just precise that, I think terminology would help.
Okay, so the colleague who asked about the PI who's interviewing the lawyer and the engineer, and saying that in the end people follow their own discipline, I think that was an example of multidisciplinary research. So often within a research collaboration, people will come and they will bring their own expertise. They will work essentially on, often it happens within big research consortia, where there'll be a number of work packages, and each work package is led by a discipline specialist, and at the end, you know, nothing really happens that alters the state of knowledge outside of those disciplines. So you can have a research collaboration that is multidisciplinary, where there isn't that bringing together, that integration of knowledge. And I would say that's what distinguishes multi and interdisciplinarity. So interdisciplinarity, you're kind of leaving your discipline at the door. You're being more open to other ideas, and somehow you're bringing together. And again, this is you know, it's very context dependent. I would recommend that you have a look at the paper in Science and Public Policy, led by Bianca Vieni, which is about how we need to embrace heterogeneity in these definitions. I realise some of you are scientists and you like precise definitions, but I think what we're arguing in that paper is that it is very context dependent. So there is no one right definition, but you have to define it as it pertains to your particular situation. But within interdisciplinarity, there is somehow this the outcome is greater. It's the what's the phrase about the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, I think. Transdisciplinarity is much trickier because again, it's context dependent. I work quite a lot with Swiss colleagues who work in sustainability science. They would see transdisciplinary research as very much a co-production of research, working with wider actors, societal actors, and those actors are involved in the generation of the research. They're not passive recipients at the end. They are co-creators, and they're involved in setting the research agenda. So that is one definition of transdisciplinary research. It's research that both spans disciplines but also spans institutional boundaries. Others will have different definitions of transdisciplinarity in terms of, I think a colleague earlier talked about being undisciplinary, you know, actually transcending this whole idea of disciplines. But that's not the more common usage as far as I'm aware. That is a very probably unhelpful quick fire definition. I think my answer to that is yes, it's helpful to think about this. I wouldn't personally get too hung up on definitions because I think it's very context dependent, and I think that in each case you have to define what you mean by what you're doing. Why is interdisciplinarity essential? Why can you not do the research without taking an interdisciplinary approach? It's my slide that says, you know, interdisciplinarity isn't everything. You know, it might be that you would actually be better approaching a research problem from a single discipline approach. So it's always asking that question of why does it have to be inter or transdisciplinary? The answer to this question, of course, will come in our forthcoming book with colleagues Bianca Vieni and Isabel Fletcher. We're actually editing a very old-fashioned reader, an anthology of key readings in inter and transdisciplinary research. We're very conscious, having done the work around the SHAPE-ID Toolkit, that there are lots of really good resources out there that people are maybe not aware of. So really foundational readings that every new inter and transdisciplinary researcher should be familiar with. And so we're putting these together in a curated anthology with a series of commentaries from inter and transdisciplinary scholars explaining how they've used these readings in their own research. And that will hopefully be out sometime in 2023. So I shall recommend it to you all in advance. The other person, of course, if you want to be up on definitions, is to read Julie Klein. And you will see Julie Klein's work mentioned in the toolkit. If you go to the understandings section, you'll see the references there, and she will give a much more cogent definition than I have.
Thank you a lot, Catherine. We will go to the next speaker.
Thank you. And enjoy the rest of your conference.